The sound of iron scraping against bone is not something history books will tell you about. But in the medieval markets of Europe, it was a sound that every man, woman, and child knew. A woman's scream choked into silence, her mouth forced open by steel, her tongue pierced so she could neither speak nor swallow without agony. The merchants kept shouting their prices. The priests kept preaching. The law kept watching. And yet, all of it, the noise, the routine, the indifference, was designed for one single purpose, to teach her that her voice did not belong to her. It belonged to the institution that forged the device now locked around her head. This was not random cruelty. It was deliberate architecture. The device was called the scold's bridle, an iron cage made for women who spoke too much, who corrected a priest, who challenged a husband, or who dared to carry knowledge that men considered dangerous. It transformed the human mouth into a chamber of torture, turning speech into punishment. But the true horror was not just the iron pressing against skin. The horror was that every man in the crowd, husbands, fathers, sons, was required to watch. It was civic duty, a ritual of public obedience. It wasn't enough to silence the woman. The system needed to remind everyone else that silence was the law. What you were never told is this: these devices were not simply punishments. They were symbols, monuments to a centuries-long project of control. Behind every rivet of iron, there was a script written by monks, theologians, and magistrates. Behind every drop of blood was doctrine that declared women to be the doorway of the devil. And behind every scream, there was a lesson whispered into the minds of onlookers: obedience is survival. Do you understand what this means? Torture in the Middle Ages was not chaotic. It was not barbarism for its own sake. It was systematized, calculated, even engineered. These devices were designed to last for hours, days, sometimes months. Not enough to kill, never that quickly, but enough to ensure that life itself became a prison sentence. It was not death they sought. It was compliance. The creation of silence so absolute that it carried into generations. A daughter in the crowd, watching her mother gag and bleed, learned the lesson before her own lips could form the words. Speak, and you suffer. Stay silent, and you survive. This is where the descent begins. Into a world where pain was not random, but scripted. Where suffering was not personal, but institutional. And where control was not maintained by chains on the body, but by chains on the mind. To understand how steel cages were wrapped around women's heads, you must first understand the ink that dripped onto parchment centuries earlier. In candlelit monasteries, men cloaked in black robes wrote words that would echo like iron across generations. They weren't inventing theology, they were weaponizing it. Augustine, Aquinas, Tertullian, church fathers whose words were copied again and again, declared that woman was a misbegotten man, the vessel of temptation, the open gate through which sin entered the world. These weren't abstract philosophies. They were blueprints. Blueprints for power, blueprints for control, blueprints for turning doctrine into devices. In the monastery of Sandon, a young priest once bent over a desk, copying Tertullian's words, "Woman is the devil's gateway." His quill scratched the page while November rain tapped against the stone windows. What he could not know, what perhaps he did know, is that his quiet act of transcription would one day translate into metal teeth-puncturing tongues in Edinburgh, Prague, and Cologne. This is how institutions work. They plant seeds in silence, and the harvest comes centuries later in blood. The theologians argued that silence was not only preferable, it was holy. To allow a woman to speak freely was to allow Eve to reach once more for the forbidden fruit. But prayer alone was never enough for the enforcers of order. No, they wanted the theology to manifest in flesh. And so, the manuals began to appear. Not scripture this time, but practical instructions. Manuals for identifying female heresy. Manuals for correction. Manuals that sketched out measurements, iron frames, leather straps, exact placements for pressure points on the female anatomy. They said it was holy duty. But let's be clear, it was engineering. Theological engineering. By the 14th century, these writings had metastasized into law. Roman decrees made a husband's right to punish his wife not just permissible, but sacred. In Cologne, debates raged about whether enforced silence saved a woman's soul. In Prague, monks wrote treatises on female hysteria and the spiritual benefits of gagging. In Rome, church lawyers drafted codes requiring men to publicly witness their wives' punishment, lest the lesson lose its power. And the lesson was always the same: her body is not hers. Her voice is not hers. Her very existence is a reminder of original sin. When the bridle bit into her tongue, it was not only her mouth being locked shut. It was the entire story of Eve being replayed, her punishment pressed into iron so that no one, not even her daughters, would ever forget. Picture a marketplace in the year 1600. The smell of fish rotting in the sun, the clatter of wooden carts over cobblestones, the church bells ringing above it all. And then, silence. Not because the city has grown still, but because a woman's scream has been muffled by iron. This is the theater of power. Torture was never hidden in medieval Europe. It was staged. A performance designed not just to punish one woman but to educate an entire population. Every device was a stage prop. Every victim was an actor forced into the role of cautionary tale. And every audience member, whether they wanted to or not, became a participant in the ritual. This was not chaos. It was choreography. The scold's bridle, the pillory, the stake, all were arranged with precision in the busiest squares, where eyes could not look away. The woman bound in iron was made into a living sermon, her suffering a gospel of silence. And as the crowd gathered, something darker happened. The fear of one victim became the obedience of thousands. Children learned before they could even write their names that speaking truth could carve iron across your face. Husbands were taught to keep their wives in line, not because they hated them, but because the law said love required discipline. And priests, oh, the priests, reminded the masses that this was not cruelty but salvation. Do you see the manipulation? Pain was only the surface. The true weapon was shame. A woman gagged in public did not simply endure agony. She was erased. Her words, her thoughts, her defiance, all dissolved into blood and silence. The crowd laughed, mocked, or averted their gaze. And in that collective silence, the system strengthened. Torture became not just an act of punishment but a ritual of normalization. By witnessing it, the people became complicit. By accepting it, they became controlled. This is the genius of psychological warfare: you don't need to kill the body when you can strangle the spirit. The iron cage locked around her head was not just metal, it was ideology solidified into steel. The marketplace was not just a place of commerce, it was a classroom where obedience was taught through spectacle. And the lesson drilled deeper than iron into flesh. It carved itself into the very mind of society. Understand this: when a system makes you watch, it is not showing you cruelty. It is showing you the future. And it is asking you, without words, will you obey, or will you be next? By the late Middle Ages, cruelty was no longer crude, it was refined. The blacksmith's forge became a laboratory, the hammer a scalpel, and the medieval workshop a factory for psychological control. Devices like the scold's bridle were not improvised tools of punishment. They were products of years of adjustment, testing, and, most disturbingly, optimization. Iron was bent and rebent, straps were tightened and loosened, measurements were adjusted again and again until the device achieved its intended purpose: maximum obedience, minimum death. They wanted suffering, not martyrs. Records from Edinburgh to Nuremberg reveal how craftsmen were commissioned directly by magistrates and bishops to perfect the art of silence. Hinges were redesigned so the cage could be locked tighter without breaking the jaw. Bits were sharpened into spikes that pressed against the tongue, not enough to sever, but enough to cause constant bleeding with every swallow. Some models even carried bells on the top of the cage so that every step the woman took rang out her shame across the streets. Do you see the design? It was humiliation turned into music. A soundtrack of suffering that reminded everyone within earshot, this is what happens when a woman speaks out of turn. But here is the part that should disturb you most: the engineers of torture were not just blacksmiths. They were theologians, magistrates, lawmakers, even physicians. Manuals described female anatomy in detail, recommending pressure points, vulnerable tissues, and methods to cause pain without killing. It was science in service of domination. A grotesque parody of medicine. Where one man studied the body to heal, another studied it to subjugate. And always, the justification was the same: Eve's sin. The myth of one woman reaching for forbidden knowledge became the eternal warrant for silencing every woman who dared to speak. The institutions that ruled medieval Europe, church, monarchy, law, did not just tolerate these devices. They sanctified them. They gave them holy purpose. The bishop's sermon turned the blacksmith's iron into a tool of salvation. The judge's decree turned a husband into a lawful executioner of silence. This was not random cruelty. This was industrialized obedience. And once a system learns how to turn belief into machinery, it never forgets. The iron cage was only the beginning. The deeper truth is this: every institution that has ever sought control begins by rewriting the human body into a device of its own. Every scar is a signature. Every wound, a form of handwriting. The bridle was not just a punishment, it was an inscription, carved into flesh, of who held power, and who did not. The iron cage eventually rusted. The straps broke. The markets grew silent. But the lesson did not vanish. That is the true genius, and horror, of institutional control. It never relies only on steel. It carves itself into memory, into identity, into the very instincts of survival. Long after the scold's bridle stopped clamping down on flesh, its shadow remained, whispering in the minds of women and men alike: silence keeps you safe. This is how oppression outlives its tools. The daughter who watched her mother bleed into iron carried that fear into her own motherhood. She taught her daughters not to speak too boldly, not to correct, not to be seen knowing too much. She didn't need the device to enforce obedience. Fear had been internalized. The institution didn't need to be there anymore, the victim had become its messenger. And so silence passed through bloodlines like an invisible inheritance, replicated not by law, but by culture itself. Understand what this means. The bridle was more than a device. It was a seed. A seed planted in the soil of human psychology, watered with fear, and harvested for centuries. And the harvest looked like submission dressed as modesty. It looked like obedience dressed as virtue. It looked like entire societies convinced that suffering was holy, that silence was sacred, that domination was natural. This is not history, it is programming. And you must ask yourself, has it truly ended? Or have the devices simply changed form? The iron cage may not sit on anyone's head today, but the mechanisms remain. They have shifted into language, words like proper, ladylike, respectable. They have shifted into law, into unspoken rules of who is heard and who is ignored. They have shifted into the algorithms of power itself, ensuring that some voices are amplified, while others are choked before they can be heard. This is the truth institutions never wanted you to see: the most powerful torture device is not the one locked on the body. It is the one you carry in your mind, inherited, unexamined, disguised as common sense. That is why I am speaking to you now, not to entertain, but to awaken. And if you've followed me this far, I want you to burn this lesson into yourself. Comment below, twice, the words, "I break the silence." Write it twice to seal it. That act is not for the algorithm, it is for you. It is a declaration that you will not inherit obedience disguised as virtue. You are here to break the chain. Do not be deceived by time. Iron rusts, laws are rewritten, churches lose their grip, but power never disappears. It adapts. The scold's bridle of the 1600s has been replaced, yes, but not destroyed. Its spirit has been resurrected in forms that no longer need steel to choke you. Today, obedience is engineered through subtler devices you don't even recognize as cages. Think about it. What is a cage, if not the control of what you can say, what you can think, what you can share? In the Middle Ages, a woman's voice was mutilated with metal. Today, voices are algorithmically buried, shadow-banned, discredited, or mocked into silence. Entire careers destroyed not by iron spikes, but by reputational guillotines. One slip of the tongue, one forbidden truth spoken aloud, and suddenly, the modern crowd does not need to laugh in the marketplace. They cancel. They erase. And the silence that follows feels no less suffocating. Consider how institutions, political, corporate, even academic, maintain their order. They do not line you up in public squares anymore. Instead, they weaponize shame and fear through media, through bureaucracy, through invisible rules you were never allowed to vote on. You learn what cannot be said. You learn what questions cannot be asked. And just like the daughter watching her mother bleed into the bridle, you internalize it. You censor yourself before anyone else needs to. That is the modern device. It does not sit on your head. It lives in your mind. And do not think for a second this is an accident. Just as monks once calculated where to place the iron to cause pain without death, modern engineers calculate how to manipulate your behavior through technology, policy, and narrative. Every click tracked, every word monitored, every deviation punished, not with spikes in your tongue, but with exclusion, with digital exile, with financial strangulation. They don't need iron anymore. They have built cages out of perception. The dark truth is this: humanity never abandoned torture. It only refined it. From iron gags in the streets of Edinburgh to silent bans on glowing screens, the principle remains the same. Control the voice, control the thought, control the future. And if you think you are free simply because you don't see the cage, that is the greatest trick the cage has ever played. There comes a moment when the curtain falls away. When you realize the cage was never just for women in medieval markets. It was never just iron teeth puncturing tongues. It was never only about religion, or law, or marriage. It was about power itself, the eternal war to decide who speaks and who is silenced. And once you see it, truly see it, you can never unsee it again. The most horrifying device made for women was not forged in the blacksmith's fire. It was forged in the human mind, the belief that silence is safety, that obedience is virtue, that suffering is holy. That belief has outlived every empire, every church, every king. And it is alive now, whispering in your own ear, urging you to keep your head down, to stay quiet, to obey. That whisper is the modern bridle. Invisible, but no less binding. You must understand, this is dangerous knowledge. Once you recognize the pattern, you can trace it everywhere. In the boardroom where truth is swallowed to protect profit. In the classroom where questions go unasked because they don't fit the curriculum. In the media where certain narratives roar and others vanish into silence. And even in your own family, where voices are smothered by tradition, by fear, by shame. The devices change shape. The function remains. But here is where the story turns. Because the very fact that you hear my voice now means the chain has cracked. The spell has been disturbed. And now the responsibility falls on you. Not to pretend you did not hear. Not to scroll past. Not to bury this under distraction. Once you know the cage exists, you are given a choice, to remain complicit in silence, or to rise against it. Make no mistake, rising will cost you. Speaking when silence is demanded will make you a target. It always has. But obedience costs far more. Obedience costs your soul. And if history has shown us anything, it is that those who obey without question do not escape suffering, they only guarantee it. So, I ask you one final time, will you be the bystander in the marketplace, eyes averted, watching another voice be caged? Or will you declare, with defiance, with fire, with the strength of those who came before you, I break the silence? Write it. Say it. Live it. Twice, if you must. Because once those words leave your lips, or your hands, they cannot be taken back. And that is how the iron rusts. That is how the cage collapses. That is how the silence ends.